It's happened to me more than once. I finish a great indie game and find out months later that it was made in RPG Maker. Poppycock, I say, but I look it up and I'll be damned, made in RPG Maker. But what is RPG Maker and why is it such a momentous occasion to find a great game made with it? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back in time, 1992, in a little country known as Japan, where a publishing company, ASCII, released a program for NEC PC 9801 Japanese home computers. This software was called RPG Tsukuru, and it would allow users to design simple RPG games like Ultima or Dragon Warrior from the comfort of their own home. This program kicked off a long line of products known as the RPG Maker series, followed up with RPG Maker 95, 2000, 2003, XP, VX, VX Ace, MV, and MZ, each iteration featuring an expanded set of tools from the previous. Now, if you enjoy being creative, writing stories, or using level editors in video games, RPG Maker is a blast to use. If you were the type of kid who swung a stick around in the backyard pretending it was the Buster Sword, this is a socially acceptable way to ignite your imagination in the same way.
I can't kill you, you're part of me. You're a fool, Sora.
Back off, I'll take you on!
These programs are approachable, but there are layers of depth you come to discover over time. The editors are preloaded with default assets such as characters, tile sets, and music. A simple turn-based battle system is also ready to be used with various pre-made enemies and weapons as well. This is Harold. He's RPG Maker MV's default cube. You'll see his smiling face every time you start a new project. He's an adventurer, which was my dream job until I turned 21 and my father sat me down and told me that adventurer hasn't been a viable career path since the mid-1800s. I grew up a little bit that day. Using a graphic interface, the user can implement events like conditional branches, loops, as well as setting enemy behavior based on specific parameters. There is certainly an upper limit in how much freedom you have as a developer, but at the very least it's a fun and non-intimidating way to learn the principles of programming logic. Recent releases of the program allow for external scripts to be loaded into the engine, allowing developers to go far beyond what was necessarily intended. So why does it have such a shitty reputation in the game dev community? Well, it's pretty simple. Anytime you create a tool so straightforward that a child could use it, children are going to use it. For every Omori, there's games that use default assets, have empty and unappealing maps, glitchy or outright broken progression, and dialogue so monumentally cringe you'd expect to see it scribbled in my 8th grade math notebook next to Linkin Park lyrics in that cool S. While it's now easier to get creative and import handmade assets, this boilerplate RPG Maker game has long plagued the community and made the engine a bit of a laughingstock. So much so that many developers using it actively try to disguise it with altered menus or custom battle systems. I wouldn't discount some of the negativity being a result of good old-fashioned engine elitism, but I tend not to take that seriously, since most of the dullards shouting "Unity sucks" or "Unreal sucks" couldn't hello world their way out of a fucking shoebox. Anyway, today I wanted to look at a cross-section of RPG Maker games, the weird, the compelling, the experimental, and the frustrating, to see what this engine and the people using it are capable of. I asked for recommendations on Twitter and Patreon, and we do be eating good here. There's a lot to cover. If you're wondering why I'm not going over some of the heavy hitters like Omori or Lisa, I tried to keep the games of shorter length to fit the bite-sized format this video is going for. And if any of these games sound interesting to you, links will be in the description. Let's begin with undoubtedly one of the most famous games in the video, Yume Nikki. Now we're starting with the game that I actually find the most difficult to talk about, because Yume Nikki's qualities don't really fit in a conventional game review. Released all the way back in 2004 by a developer known as Kikiyama, Yume Nikki is one of the first games made with RPG Maker to find some level of international cult appeal. It's not hard to see why. It's a real weird game. It might even be more accurate to call it an interactive experience. Although that's 8 syllables and pretentious as hell, so game is fine, thanks. You play as a girl named Madatsuki as she explores different worlds created within her dreams. In her cramped apartment, you've got a handful of options. Enjoy fresh air on the balcony, play some Okama Game Sphere,
Fucking day, dude.
Or go to bed, where the meat of the game takes place. You're presented with a hall of doors, each one leading to a distinctly different dream world. These areas are confusing to navigate, with nonsensical architecture, bizarre characters, and endless voids to traverse. Thankfully, despite their size, the worlds loop back on each other, meaning when you see the same object twice, you'll know you've made a full lap, at least in most cases. If you find yourself in this maze, well, just remember, life isn't all about having fun. Sometimes it's about being very bored. And then annoyed. Occasionally, you'll come across an interactable item called an effect. Effects are largely cosmetic, but some change the game world a bit, such as the bicycle, which lets you move around faster, or the frog mask, which allows you to maintain your pace in water. Then there's stuff like the blonde wig. Yeah! Now we're playing with power! Some effects are required to interact with the environment in order to find other effects, or occasionally unlocking an odd or creepy scene of seemingly no consequence, aside from making you uncomfortable. The goal of the game is to traverse each of these worlds and find all of the effects, which, full disclosure, I never managed to do because I'm bad at this game. A lot of these areas are confusing and vast, leading you to rely on abstract landmarks in the environment in order to make sense of where you are. Therefore, I think the only way to find all of the effects is to spend a lot of time wandering around or looking up a walkthrough, the latter of which in my mind defeats the whole purpose of Yume Nikki. The victories, if you can call them that, in this game are few and far between, and therefore all the more rewarding when you come across them yourself. If you plan on using a walkthrough, well, you might as well just look up a playthrough on YouTube. The first-hand experience has been robbed from you in either case. My first impression of this game is that it reminded me quite a bit of an eccentric little PS1 game called LSD Dream Emulator. The primary difference being LSD's added dimension of 3D, as well as its somewhat randomly generated worlds, as opposed to Yume Nikki, whose levels are hand-designed and never change in a significant way. In the right mood, I can enjoy the laid-back appeal of just immersing yourself in a strange world. In both cases, music is predominantly eerie little synth loops. In Yume Nikki, the tracks sometimes evoke Aphex Twin's creepier work. Repetitive looping acting in the game's favor as you find yourself in an almost hypnotic state while playing. Also, like LSD, the footstep sounds change depending on the terrain you're stepping on, sometimes leading to a surprise when you transition areas. The sound design in general enhances the creepy atmosphere. You know nothing bad can happen to you, but what if something does? If you play Yume Nikki long enough, you're bound to stumble across some disturbing or cryptic sights, which has led to quite a number of theories over the years, some of which are interesting, many of which are sophomoric attempts to make the game's quirks edgier or more significant, as these things tend to go. Like the Silent Hill games, sometimes technical limitations or ambiguous looking sprites has people tilting at windmills, applying meaning where perhaps none was intended. But hey, it's an abstract work, so you do you. Nonetheless, it's fascinating to see such an array of interpretations. The community this simple game has formed serves to show what an effect it had on people. There are a lot of secrets in this game, and those brief smacks of dopamine when you use the right effect in the right spot and trigger some event are savory indeed. But all the same, it's difficult to judge this as a game just because of how unorthodox it is. We live in an age of indie game supremacy. We've all seen our fair share of deliberately weird games or walking simulators, but it's important to note that Yume Nikki came out almost 20 years ago now. Something like this would have been truly novel at that point. You certainly didn't hear of non-RPG games being made in RPG Maker, although at this point they're arguably more prevalent. With that in mind, Yume Nikki is an interesting little time capsule. Its surrealist style blazed a trail at the time, proving that with the right tools, imagination can flourish without programming knowledge or budget. It's free to download on Steam, and I say it's worth an evening, turning the lights out, grabbing a piping hot beverage. Oh, fuck! Too hot. Too hot. Alright, with Yume Nikki out of the way, I can move along and talk about something a little more straightforward. Should be easier to write about this, so never mind. Hylics is a recreational program released in 2015, developed by Mason Lindroth. The game, like Yume Nikki, takes place in a world straight out of a fever dream. However, for protagonist Wayne, this is anything but a dream. Aesthetically, this game is, it's out there. The visuals are a blend of drawn assets, CG, and claymation, passed through some kind of halftone filter for shading and manipulated in various other ways. The character designs alone are unhinged, but the world around you is completely absurd as well. Walls and walkways often resemble balloon animals tied together. There's just an intentional discomfort running through every screen of the game. It's an ugly game, but don't take that the wrong way. Some games are ugly because of a lack of art direction. This game has a very intentional, impressively consistent art style. It knows it's ugly and leans heavily into that, creating a visual context in which the game's ridiculous moments never feel out of place. I find a lot of times when games lean into absurdism or the kind of randomness that characterizes Hylics dialogue, it feels like a cop-out. At the very lowest end, developers lean into absurdism because it's easier than constructing something coherent and potentially having a substandard product. But Hylics exists kind of inverse to that. The preposterous nature of the world is designed from the ground up to be this way. From the visuals, such as the walking animation, which looks like Quap being played with a Guitar Hero controller, to the writing, to the soundtrack, which is an excellent collection of psychedelic and stoner metal tracks. You can see the vision that Lindroth had for this game. It's cogent with the final product. Unlike Yume Nikki, Hylics actually has some RPG gameplay that we can evaluate too. Certain areas are populated by enemies visible on the world map, and coming into contact with them will initiate a traditional turn-based battle. What's interesting is that there's no experience or level ups in Hylics, which is somewhat unusual for this type of game. Rather, your effectiveness in battle largely comes down to two factors. The first is the equipment you have. The central zone in Hylics, Snatfrit the Fatal City, is host of various shops where you can purchase instruments, garbs, and accoutrements. These will raise stats such as mightiness, jollity, and philology. Although you can largely just rely on higher numbers being better, certain equipment allows for critical protection against status ailments, so different equipment is worthwhile in different circumstances, which is a nice bit of depth I wouldn't have expected from this game. The second factor that determines your effectiveness in battle is the abilities you have at your disposal. Scattered throughout Hylics' world, you'll find television sets that, after an interesting animation, imbue your boy with some arcane knowledge. You'll stumble across some of these while pursuing the main quest, but a lot actually requires some puzzle solving or other investment. Typically, those are the really good abilities. To say Hylics is a bit unclear on how or where you're supposed to go to pursue your objectives is actually a boon in this case. You're dropped off in these areas with no real direction, forced to explore, and often that's where you'll find character abilities or optional characters who can join your party. I gotta say, I was genuinely taken aback by how well balanced the combat is here, but before I move one inch further, I gotta mention these battle animations. Spellbinding. More than many games made in RPG Maker, Hylics leans heavily into status effects. This lends an element of strategic thinking in combat, as even with high-level equipment, your characters are of no use if they're paralyzed. Often this means devoting one character to status prevention skills, another to nuclear strength attacks, another to replenishing flesh or will, its HP and MP respectively, and then changing rules where necessary. Fights can go on for a pretty long time, but I never felt either overpowered or underpowered in this game, which is really something special when it comes to designing an RPG. Even after purchasing higher level equipment, you feel rewarded and more effective, but you still can't mindlessly spam attacks. It's worth noting that even if you do fall in battle, Hylics has one of the most clever death systems in any RPG I've ever played. Upon loss in battle and after a brief unsettling animation, you'll be sent to a separate area rather than face a game over screen. From here you can select any one of these colored crystals, which correspond to a crystal you've attuned in the game world. After selecting your crystal of choice, stepping into the portal will send you to that corresponding zone in the world. It's like a checkpoint system that gives you some agency. If you want to start where you left off, there's likely a crystal nearby. If you figure you're short on healing items or equipment, you can teleport straight to Snatfrit. There's a fish guarding a balcony in this area that opens up after you've died 3 times, allowing you to snag some better equipment, which is kind of like a player-directed difficulty system. It's a shrewd idea and prevents Hylics from ever feeling frustrating, even upon suffering death. Outside of the gameplay and presentation, the writing is, it's cockamamie. It's eyebrow-raising sometimes and hilarious other times. While the complete and utter lack of player direction can be frustrating, it's all a baked-in part of the Hylics experience. My only real gripe aside from this would be the visuals occasionally obfuscating exits and transition areas in the environment, and the odd insta-death enemy, which can lead to a lot of reloading. Hylics is a truly one-of-a-kind game. The level of imagination on display here is unlike anything I've seen in most recent indie games, with an art style that would be nigh impossible to replicate, an awesome and appropriately quirky soundtrack, and some surprisingly thoughtful gameplay. For $3 American on Steam, you could do a lot worse. There's also a sequel out made in Unity that's apparently fantastic, so I certainly plan on checking that out too. Now for something a little different. Lawmage Academy is an RPG being developed by a single person, a developer known as Verinius. It's described on Steam as a magic school RPG where you learn spells, craft potions, make friends, and go on exciting adventures as you uncover the dark secrets of Lawmage Academy. If that didn't light your head on fire, let me distill this down to a real juicy elevator pitch. It's Harry Potter meets Persona. Yeah, I feel like there's more than one person who'd see this as a dream game. You might think there's no way he's pulling this off as a solo dev. I don't believe it. The demo is probably just a 15-minute, highly curated vertical slice. The final game is never coming out. Oh, ye of little faith. I went in with similar doubts, one might even say a cynical attitude, given how many RPG Maker projects of such caliber I've seen announced and then last online 10 years ago. Having finished the demo, I believe that Verinius can make this happen. As the game opens up, you'll join one of 4 houses. There's the courageous Foxhelm, the litigious and insular Drakewood, the good-natured and free-thinking Visage, and the extremely talented, sexy, and all-around well-loved House of Solstice. After a few preliminary questions, I was assigned to House Solstice. The game's introductory sequence is quite lengthy as you're railroaded into taking specific classes and taught the basics of crafting, combat, and how the academy works. Much like Persona, there's a limited amount of time in the day, and it's largely up to you how you spend it. You've got different friends who act as social links. There are side quests and collectible activities to explore, and optional classes you can take to become more advanced in certain areas. It's when the game opens up here that I expected the demo to end, but that was not the case. Certain main missions such as exams are mandatory to attend, but until that point on the calendar, you're given free rein. It's a good idea to pursue friendships, bolstering your comrades' abilities, and train in different spells because the combat in this game is no joke. Using a side view turn-based battle system, Lawmage reaches far beyond what one might expect an RPG Maker game to do. Enemies have defenses and weaknesses based on different elements and damage types. Throughout the battle, you're responsible for trying all the different types of attacks until you find an enemy's weakness. At that point, you can repeatedly exploit those weaknesses until the enemy's guard breaks and you can deal a lot more damage. Some of these bosses are no slouch, so it's important to keep your party members healed well between turns. The battle system works great, continually forcing you to experiment until you find a weakness you can seize on, and then charging you with remembering that for future encounters. Of course, you'll have to bring a variety of party members with different strengths and weaknesses with you. That, or you can spend time studying spells on your own time, possibly becoming tired and ineffective if you stay up too late. Here you can begin to see the symbiotic relationship different aspects of this game have with one another. You can't ignore any facet of the academy, because without a well-rounded use of time, your stats or relationships may suffer in unexpected ways. I'll be careful not to overstate it. Despite beautiful portrait art, the interactions between party members are quite limited at this point, and if you're careful with your time, you can experience nearly everything the game has to offer by the time the demo ends. Personally, I prefer when games like Persona force you to spend your time in certain ways while sacrificing other possibilities. It lends a feeling of choice and consequence to the game and encourages replayability. That said, hopefully Lawmage Academy's final release contains enough content that those choices will have to be made. Expanding on some of this content, let's start with the social links. Working title. I know the game doesn't call them that, but it just best describes them. You begin the game with only one friend, Ein. No, a slightly worse Ein, but he's still endearing. As you play the game, you're introduced to more characters who can be interacted with passively or included in your immediate party, the latter of which can be chatted with, affecting your relationship. Much like my real-life relationships, I said things that made people uncomfortable while adapting to their disposition. Unlike real life, they talked to me again, so I could amend these errors and gain their trust. I would say there are 1.5 blocks of time in the day, so spending time with others, studying to learn spells, doing odd jobs for money, or heading into the wilderness to train all take up one solid block. In the evening, you're limited to only a couple tasks and risk suffering tiredness the next day if you engage. You can drink coffee to offset this, thankfully, though I'm anxiously awaiting the weird guy selling Ritalin out of his locker expansion pack. Visually, the game is quite nice. It's very colorful, the mapping is generally great, and the hand-drawn assets give Lawmage a lot of personality. The HUD, which includes a functional quest journal, is also a step above what I expected. I do have some minor criticisms, however. First of all, the game does use some default assets, if not very commonly used asset packs. It's a nice looking set of sprites, but it's also instantly evident to anyone who's used RPG Maker that a lot of tiles look familiar. There's also a lack of movement on some maps. Without some particle effects, shadows of clouds overhead, or leaves flowing in the breeze, things feel a bit stagnant, which is largely noticeable because of how much screen real estate is given to these maps, which is kind of an anomaly with RPG Maker games. Finally, there's the 3-frame walking animation. For those unfamiliar with animation, character sprites walking cycle through a number of still frames. And in a very general sense, the more frames you have, the more fluid or realistic the walking animation is. In a very, very general sense. 3 frames is usually seen as the bare minimum, with 5 frames being kind of a sweet spot for top-down 2D games such as this. While 3-frame walking animation works for 8-bit or visually simplistic games, Lawmage Academy is dense, beautiful, and colorful, and it sells itself short by limiting the character animation in this way. I wouldn't expect a solo dev to animate every character with so many frames, but a more fluid animation for the main crew would help them pop and live up to the standards of the world around them. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the game's soundtrack. As a whimsical man, I can recognize whimsy from a mile away, and my friends, this soundtrack has whimsy in spades. Whimsy is only 1 degree of separation from comfy, which this game is. The battle and boss themes are also pretty hype. Going through the story, you're introduced to some fun characters, although the demo doesn't last quite long enough to explore them in any depth. At present, the only relationships you can establish are with your immediate party members, but hopefully in the future there's some level of character building with the various instructors. I know some thirsty students will want to spend time getting extra credit, but it ain't that kind of RPG Maker game. The main mission allows you to explore some different areas, leading me to believe the final product will be, well, a legitimate, full-fledged RPG. Let me be clear, what Verinius has achieved here is already astounding. By the time I was wrapping up my time with the demo, I had clocked in almost 5 hours of time, which is longer than many full-priced finished games on this list, and there was still very little wasted time. Lawmage efficiently introduces you to new concepts, characters, and ideas at a steady and manageable pace. Honestly, I want more. If this sounds interesting to you, go ahead and download the demo from Steam. Once again, link in the description. Maybe wishlist the game if you like what you see. Indie developers like this need all the support they can get. Godspeed, Verinius. I'll be watching closely. You know, I'm starting to feel like Lawmage Academy was the fever dream and all this other weird shit is just my waking reality. So this is Toilet in Wonderland, and it's, well, why don't I just read you the back of the virtual box here. The goal of this adventure game is to find all the toilets in this Wonderland. The constipation rate is a percentage gauge of how much you have accomplished in this game. Each time you use a new toilet or use a laxative, it slowly decreases. If you can reach 0%, the ending might change a little. Be aware that this game contains violent imagery and shocking scenes that some may find inappropriate. Player discretion is advised. I feel like if I organized a get-together, inviting these RPG Maker developers to like a wine and cheese party or something. It would be one of the most tense, strange, and eye-opening experiences of my life. Why is the pixel art in this game so fucking good? Oh, never mind. Okay, so is this an asset pack? Or maybe the game was intentionally constructed to have a strong dichotomy between the legitimate pixel art and the terrible Microsoft Paint art. What an odd position it is to be wondering such a thing. This is the only game on the list where I didn't take any notes, because translating this experience into words is a task I am ill-equipped to do. Okay, so being reductive as possible, Toilet in Wonderland is a puzzle adventure game, I guess? Yeah, no RPG elements or combat, and the interface is quite different than most RPG Maker games. You can select an emote from the list and use it in-game. Oh shit, sorry dude. Just trying to press the talk button. So the game opens up with Michael Jackson telling our protagonist, Mira, that she's the chosen one, and you're given free reign to wander around the environment, looking for X-Lax and the Holy Grail, toilets. The game is a blend of comedy and horror, the latter of which is mostly pervasive in the general atmosphere of the world, which is just off. Very creepy. Occasionally the game branches into outright horror, sort of. But for the most part, there's just a sense that something is off. I'd say it's kinda similar to Yume Nikki in that way, but honestly, I prefer the way Wonderland handles the dreamlike ambience. I just find it a bit more coherent, and the brief moments of comedy are something I look forward to while exploring. There's a toilet room, much like Yume Nikki's door room, and this is kind of the central hub of the game, I guess. From here you can leave and branch off in any direction. Or, if you've found some toilets, you can return to the area in which you found them. So yeah, the game does use some asset packs for a lot of the visuals, but they're good looking assets, and the mapping in the game is outstanding. When I refer to mapping, I'm talking about how all of the tiles and sprites are arranged to give off the illusion that this is a real place. The forest areas are lush, objects are placed appropriately in the environment, and there's just overall an attention to detail you might not expect from a free game called Toilet in Wonderland. Of course, off the beaten path you'll find some more homemade quality graphics. The music is implemented in a similar style, with some recognizable MIDI tracks, pre-recorded music, and audio asset packs as well. It's all over the map, which is fine, because this game is all over the map. Yeah, this might just be the moon falling theme from Majora's Mask, but hey, that's a great song, and this is a strangely atmospheric segment. Even though there are no hard cuts in this game, you could categorize the different areas as levels. Like this area called Unsafe Haven, where a giant fist drawn in MS Paint called the Absolute God of Violence randomly flies down and crushes Mira. As far as I can tell, there's no way to avoid this. You just have to save every few steps and then reload. The game won't win any design awards, but I can't deny that it's pretty funny. There's also this segment that does a pretty great job of lampooning RPG Maker horror games. You're trapped in a hell house with Mario. He chases you and you have to hide in rooms until he's gone. Like the games it apes, such as Ao Oni, it's basically impossible to know when he's coming, and you just have to save every 30 seconds. From a gameplay standpoint, it's frustrating, but it also does a pretty great job of pulling down the curtain and showing what makes some of those horror games scary. Yeah, having a sharp noise play or face pop out is gonna be scary no matter what. That's your character's father, by the way. You're encouraged to find all the X-Lax and toilets in order to reach a constipation level of 0, and thankfully the game isn't overly obtuse about that. Most of the collectibles are pretty straightforward, involving you exploring and watching a cutscene. These cutscenes, by the way, are really well coordinated. Considering RPG Maker just sequentially executes these movements and sound effects, the comedic timing is A1. Excellent job on that front. I got my constipation level down to 0%, but only got a silver toilet trophy. I gotta admit, I feel a little ripped off. Must have missed something. On the upside, the ending is absolutely stunning.
Yes!
very kino. Toilet in Wonderland is another little experimental project. I enjoy its sense of humor. It reminds me of early internet, pre-memes and 17th level irony. Just sort of an innocent stupidity with enough edge to keep you interested. For the low price of free, this one is an easy recommendation. Once in a blue moon, you stumble across a game. Maybe someone tells you to play it, maybe it pops up in your recommended feed on Steam. It's a game that you probably wouldn't think to play for whatever reason, but the stars align and you decide to boot it up. After finishing the game, you sit in silence for a few minutes, thanking your lucky stars that you stepped out of your RPG-centric echo chamber. Wait a minute, I think this is just me. For long enough to experience it. For me, that's OneShot. OneShot is a puzzle adventure game released in 2016 by developer Future Cat, and boy did I sleep on this one. The game starts straightforwardly enough. You take control of a little cat child named Nico, learning to use the interface as you escape your apartment. By the opening puzzle, I had a feeling my expectations would be blown out of the water. The game had a really distinctive design, and that first puzzle was pretty clever, but I hadn't seen nothing yet. As you venture out into a more open environment, you find an alien world without a sun. Left behind are dilapidated machines and robots of varying talkativeness. It feels lonely for our poor little protagonist, that is, until Nico meets you. Nico starts referring to you, the one behind the keyboard, by name, and there's no name input. This game is pulling your user information from somewhere. As you guide Nico, helping them solve puzzles with your limitless wisdom, the child gains an admiration for you, starts having conversations with you, seeing you as an omnipotent figure, without which they would be hopelessly lost. Rather than simply acting as an interface between you and the game world, Nico starts to feel like a friend, a lost child who needs your guidance and relies on your comforting presence to get through the darkest points in the game. You're often addressed directly, and some of these interactions are just too adorable. This unusual narrative style aside, OneShot plays, for the most part, like you might expect an adventure puzzle game to play. You enter new areas, encounter new roadblocks, and search for items or combinations that might help you progress. Unfortunately, for as unique as your relationship to your character is, the gameplay does suffer from some of the foibles one might associate with the point-and-click genre. Mike, it's your house, just use the front door. For one thing, there are often item uses or combinations that feel like a bit of a reach. In the best case scenario, these adventure game puzzles should be challenging enough that you actually have to scratch your head thinking about it, but obvious enough that you feel like a dope for spending 15 minutes trying to combine an Allen wrench with a coffee pot when all you had to do was throw baby all along. It often doesn't feel like that in OneShot. Hints are occasionally scattered around in some areas, but you'll often come across a solution simply by trying everything and stumbling across the answer. Compounding this is the relatively large size of OneShot's areas. Unlike most adventure games where single screens connect to each other, OneShot's top-down perspective sometimes obscures important points of interest, forcing you to comb each screen on the off chance that you've missed something, somewhat alleviating that problem as the fast travel system, which is appreciated. Now, just to be clear, these frustrating moments are the exception, not the rule. Puzzles, for the most part, are logical and clever. You'll often have these personal interactions with Nico that just feel like such a great reward for completing a section. Speaking with all the little denizens and robots, piecing together what's happened to this world and what will happen, the plot here is tremendously told, with plenty of charming characters bursting at the seams with personality, if only for the short time you'll know them. Visually, the game has a nice and distinctive style. The pixel art likely won't blow you away, but there's an elegant simplicity to the characters and environments that takes full advantage of a very limited color palette. When I think of OneShot, a clear picture of its world is drawn in my mind. I really love Nico's glowing eyes. On top of giving this little sprite so much character, they persist between screen transitions, which is one of my favorite little flourishes in this game. The glow and lighting effects in general are used really well in OneShot, bringing some life to this despondent world, guiding you and Nico to your destination. Now, I can't talk about the presentation without mentioning the music. which fits beautifully alongside the visuals and the story being told. During the game's exploration and puzzle segments, the music is perfectly contemplative. It's droning and repetitive enough for your brain to settle down, but never noticeable enough to distract or become annoying. As Nico reminisces over memories of their own world, the tracks frame this childlike innocence so perfectly. Your paternal instincts activate, and you just need to protect the cat child. As for the finer aspects of the plot, things are relatively straightforward. You and Nico stumble across a light bulb, supposedly this world's new sun, and its only hope. From there, you set off to the tower at the center of the world to affix this new sun, being hailed as the chosen ones by all those you meet along the way. You'll find interesting and sometimes tragic characters, help them solve problems if you can, and move closer to your destination. As the game moves further and further along, some of these puzzles become ambitious beyond any expectation I would have had. This game uses your computer in ways I had no idea an RPG Maker game was capable of doing, almost to the point where it's a little creepy. As the plot and the game itself begin to break the fourth wall more and more often, there's this gradual emotional crescendo culminating in a truly beautiful climax. The game involves the player so directly, you can't help but feel tied to the fate of this world and little Nico, and that makes the highs and lows so much more impactful. I don't dare spoil the ending. If you haven't played this game, I can't recommend it enough. It's funny, clever, sad, and only occasionally frustrating, but never derivative. It's a one-of-a-kind experience that I won't forget, and a journey that could never exist in any other medium. If there's any praise I can offer a video game higher than that, I don't know what it is. Alright, I need a palate cleanser after all that emotional shit. So now we're gonna be talking about To the Moon? That's what I decided to play next? Jesus, my heart's already grown 3 sizes today. Any more crying and I'll develop cardiomegaly. Here, this one looks manageable. Let's do Suits instead. Suits, a business RPG, was another game released in 2016, this time by Technomancy Studios. As you can probably tell by the name, we're returning to glorious RPG Maker combat, this time with an Office Depot makeover. After naming your character, you're introduced to the workforce. This is a depressingly corporate black and white world in which each person is just a cog in a much larger machine. Speaking of black and white, you might notice the game's art style, which is comprised largely of hand-drawn pencil doodles. It's an original idea. I don't think I've seen a game do this before. That doesn't mean the world isn't drab to look at, but that's also the point. The gameplay is more in line with what you'd expect from the engine. You move through different areas, get into random battles, fight an area boss, or collect some specific item and move on. Structurally, the game is presented as a series of districts you move through in a linear manner, such as the Law District or the Financial District. Each district is thematically different, with interior locations and denizens matching the current area. For example, the Law District has you partaking in some ridiculous trials. The combat system is pretty simplistic. One character has a paralyze attack, and once you figure that out, the rest of the game is just a matter of using that and spamming your strongest attacks to overcome enemies. There's a fairly decent difficulty balance though, so there's some encouragement to go find money or better gear. There's also a decent host of recruitable characters, all of which are optional, so if you don't go hunting, you'll probably be up shit creek by the final act. To Suit's credit, there are actually quite a few secrets hidden around the game, along with some Steam achievements if you're into that kind of thing. So there's reason to scour areas. You're usually rewarded for your curiosity, and some of the interactions are genuinely funny. The writing in general never really struck me as much as, say, Toilet in Wonderland. Suits occasionally leans into the mundane, the absurd, the social critique, and the dark, but it ends up splitting the difference and never really kills it in any one of these areas. It often feels like it doesn't really know what kind of tone it's going for, which by itself can lead to some amusing moments, but the game just doesn't always land. Humor is an interesting thing though. What doesn't resonate with me might be your bread and butter, so don't take my word for it. But I guess when it comes to these types of games, I just prefer a more focused experience. Based on the reviews I saw, I went in expecting some kind of dark, surreal version of Office Space, but the game doesn't really have much to say about its subject matter beyond the surface level. If it was about half as long with only the best material left in, I'd have a more positive opinion in general, but by the end of the game, it had kind of overstayed its welcome. Now there are some great moments though. This part where you and an associate drill into a bank vault and have to wait 5 minutes in real time with occasional awkward conversation is genuinely hilarious. As mentioned, the art style does lend a sort of general weirdness to the game. It looks unlike anything I've seen, I'll put it that way. The little flipbook style cutscenes were a great inclusion too. I also really like the soundtrack. There are some wacky tracks, some droning ambience where appropriate. The track Pain Station, well, it just slaps. The attempt at a story is all over the place, which I think ends up being a net negative, because A, I didn't really care what happened, which isn't a problem if the game is funny or interesting enough to hold your attention, but I didn't find it was, and B, it makes white-collar work look like the most intense, interesting, and off-the-wall career choice you could make, which kind of flies in the face of the game's message. It's a lampooning that inadvertently comes across as an endorsement. It tries to present this society in which corporatism has become inextricable from not just government, but daily life itself. Yet, we find all kinds of free-spirited characters doing their own thing, acting with agency. Yeah, there are sections like the factory tour which hint at something darker, but the game never really takes that ball and runs with it. There's a sequel out now, Suits Absolute Power, and it looks like a huge improvement, so sometime in the future I'll take a look at that one too. For now, would I recommend Suits a business RPG? Well, look, it's 99 cents on Steam. There's enough value in the aesthetic of the game alone for that price. The question is it worth your time? If you like random and heavily referential humor, you'll probably get more mental nourishment out of Suits than I did. I prefer a more focused experience, and as such, it's just not for me. However, I'd like to take a time here to mention something. I have the utmost respect for any developer, especially a solo dev, that actually manages to finish a game. Whether it's made in Unity, RPG Maker, or Godot. Conceptualizing and finishing a game is a monumental achievement, so as much as a game like Suits might not be to my taste, don't let it undermine the fact that Technomancy has completed 2 games now. That's more of a cultural and artistic contribution to the world than these videos will ever be. I truly believe that. Anyway, fuck Fear and Hunger and the people who made it. Sorry about that. That above line was written while I was hot off another catastrophic failure in the world of Fear and Hunger. I've cooled down and I'm ready to give it another try. Oh, what a piece of shit. What was I even supposed to do? I am officially done with this game. I'm not doing this whole first floor thing over again. But what if I find some better gear this time? If you're looking for a fun, fair, and rewarding dungeon crawler with a great difficulty balance, likable characters, and innovative mechanics, I don't know, go play Arx Fatalis or something. If you're a gambling addict, masochist, or some combination of both, Fear and Hunger is your game. Now, don't get it twisted. Just because Fear and Hunger evokes almost exclusively negative emotions from the player doesn't mean it's a bad game. That's its goal. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What is Fear and Hunger? Well, Fear and Hunger in Las Vegas is a 2018 dungeon crawler with an emphasis on survival horror. I do mean survival, and I do mean horror. After selecting one of 4 classes, you'll generate your character's skills, equipment, and backstory based on how you answer questions. You're dropped in front of the dungeon, and from the very first screen, it's clear this game isn't interested in holding your hand. Well, fuck. Even for seasoned dungeon crawler fans, adjusting to this game's difficulty takes time and patience. That's because the inherent victory condition in Fear and Hunger is RNG, luck of the draw. Will the enemy rip your arm off? Heads or tails? Will you find a book on the shelf? Heads or tails? Will the book instantly kill you when you read it? Heads or tails? Like real life, randomness can be influenced through preparation and the recognition of opportunity. But ultimately, you'll always be its bitch if it says so. Full disclosure, I haven't made it very far in Fear and Hunger, though not for lack of trying, so you can almost treat this more like a first impressions, although I've spent hours playing the game. The first thing I noticed booting it up is the art, which is really appealing in a way that I haven't seen in an RPG Maker game. The style is grim, eschewing the colorful pixel art or default asset look many games on the engine use and leaning into a painted looking, almost impressionistic style of gothic artwork. There are a surprising number of animations in the game too, portraying the removal of limbs and other various carnal desires in relatively high detail for such a limited number of pixels. The enemies populating the world give off an intimidating aura, and the number of visual details dotting the environment is really quite impressive. However, one-upping the visual design in my opinion is the sound design. Initially, I played Fear and Hunger with a lousy pair of $20 Logitech speakers, but putting on my sound-canceling headphones later that night and truly immersing myself, I felt fearful.
It's all toilet sounds.
But not hungry. The ambient soundscapes here are superb. Some of the most atmospheric, anxiety-inducing audio I've heard in a game, period. It often reminded me of Silent Hill's soundtrack and its ability to have you questioning whether or not what you're hearing is occurring in-game. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. In the right setting, Fear and Hunger is more nerve-wracking to play than some legitimate horror games. And not just because of the occasional jump scare, but the presentation of the world and all of its eldritch horrors. It's the kind of game that gives a sensitive boy like me nightmares. But that's just how Fear and Hunger is. It's relentlessly depressing, evil, and sad. You'll witness tragedy and just be forced to move on. Hell, the game tries to coax you to joining the madness. If sensitive subjects give you pause, yeah, that's a broad statement because this game's got all of them, you're probably not going to enjoy your time in the dungeon. This game wants to get under your skin. It depicts a hopeless world and does a damn good job of it. Speaking on the gameplay now, yeah, coin flips.
Heads then. Well done.
Now, to be fair, there's a number of interesting mechanics in the game that really take this engine to its limits. First of all, there's fear, and also hunger. Your character will gradually succumb to madness as they explore the dungeon, which can be staved off with the consumption of alcohol or certain elixirs. As hunger creeps in, you'll have to scavenge for mushrooms, meat, and bread, whatever you can find, sometimes risking parasites or poisoning in the process. All of this dependency on resources to survive means interacting with a veritable truckload of barrels and crates, hoping each one will have what you need. Now, crafting recipes can be learned to lessen the burden on green herbs, but like so many things in this damn game, their location comes down to RNG. Don't rely on save scumming either. Saves are the rarest resource of all. I've only found 2 points to save. One is a bed, which becomes virtually unusable after one sleep because a crowman starts watching you. The other is a consumable book. Fear and Hunger makes Kingdom Come Deliverance's save system look like Bioshock's Vita Chambers. It's brutal and it doesn't care. The floors and areas themselves are semi-randomly generated. It seems there are a few floor plans that the game cycles through upon new game, meaning you'll get familiar with the starting area pretty quick. I think this is a good compromise between preset dungeons and procedural generation. There's a handcrafted quality to these dungeons. You can't go 2 rooms without encountering something interesting or novel. The containers appear to have a bit more randomness, as sometimes you'll hit the jackpot and find several healing items in one room, and other times you'd give your left nut for a piece of cloth. Knowing this game, that's probably an option. I have yet to discover why anal bleeding is on the list of status ailments, although I have a few ideas. I can't show you most of the enemies I encountered because they just have giant dicks swinging between their legs, or stingers, right? It's a dick. It's an armored dick. Speaking of enemies, combat takes a bit of an unexpected turn in this game as well. Like Hylics, there's no way to gain experience or level up in Fear and Hunger. For this reason, you're generally better off avoiding enemies as they're visible on the map. Your view distance is limited, expanded only marginally with a torch, so enemies will often get the drop on you. I tried using bear traps, but they just kind of seem to walk around them, so I'm not really sure what the point is. In a fight, the player always acts first, and while this is an advantage, it is a necessary one. The focus on combat here is dismemberment, because of course it is. Unlike, say, Fallout's VAT system, there's actually good reason to target body parts that aren't the head. Cutting off arms or legs might prevent the enemy from doing a special attack or throw them off balance, making them vulnerable. You can go straight for the head, but you'll probably miss off the bat. Some enemies don't need a head to function. At the end of the day, strategy makes a difference, but good old-fashioned RNG is the deciding factor. And that's what it's all about. It's a game of chance, but it's a well-made game of chance. Yes, it's frustrating. Yes, I've gone through the introductory area like 5 or 6 times, trying new characters and hoping for better outcomes, but I can't deny there's something about this game, an addictive quality that just makes you want to face the dungeons over and over again. You hope you can see more of its eerie world and inhabitants. I'd be pissing in the wind if I said, they should make a Babby's First Dungeon Crawler difficulty. Unfairness is inherent to Fear and Hunger's design, for better or for worse, and it's for that reason that I can't recommend this game to everyone. But to whom this sounds appealing, you'll find something special in Fear and Hunger. For $8 US on Steam, give it a look. There's also a sequel being developed called Fear and Hunger Termina with a very unique setting, so check that out too. And we're back to the cult classics, this time with Space Funeral. You want absurdism? You really want absurdism? Okay, I'll give you absurdism, mixed with a healthy dose of that weird early internet humor I was talking about for Toilet in Wonderland. Space Funeral is an RPG released in 2010 by developer The Catamites. In Space Funeral, you play as a sad boy named Philip. And I mean it, in the class section of the menu, he's listed as sad. Philip is a strange, deformed child, and his strange, deformed parents think he needs to get out into the broader world and eat his greens. While walking around, blah, 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 what you find is a world warped to hell, a shadow of its former self. It's up to Philip to save the day, and that means performing a variety of seemingly inane tasks and speaking with some truly strange characters, such as Leghorse, Philip's greatest ally. NPCs go on about cryptic nonsense, but the dialogue in this game is entertaining. This exchange with Dracula is nothing short of masterful. Also, Philip is a fish here for some reason. With no irony whatsoever, I can say that the exploration and puzzles in this game are actually not bad. There's a lot of stuff to uncover, dialogue often being a reward in and of itself, and the game cleverly operates within the bounds of RPG Maker. I've mentioned a weird vibe or atmosphere that surrounds a lot of these games, and that's here as well. I'm starting to believe it's as much a result of the engine itself as an intentional artistic choice. The game has a very simple look. A lot of computer doodles. It might not be the most visually appealing game, but it gets the job done. These types of games very much feel like a movement to me, like a no-wave, fuck you type statement being made about game development. In particular, indie game development at that time, which was often seen as a small, pretentious circle of developers high on the smell of their own farts. For as simplistic as a lot of these old RPG Maker games might appear to be, this modern guerrilla DIY movement of indie devs probably owes a debt of gratitude to these games, which showed up looking like this and made a cult fanbase out of it. Space Funeral is first and foremost a comedy-centric RPG. It's more focused on incorporating humor in the moment-to-moment gameplay than any of the other games on this list, and it largely succeeds in doing this. You know that one guy you went to school with who always said some truly hilarious shit and had weird hobbies like carving faces into sticks, but was just introverted enough that he'd make you laugh and then disappear into the ether before anyone could become friends with him? This game is made by that guy, I'm convinced. I think that's what I find so appealing about this game. It doesn't bend to any conventions. It feels like the unfiltered product of a unique mind, just some way to clean a brain full of wacky ideas, the best type of art, not trying to prove anything to anyone. Like, you go to a steak farm and pick out a steak to take with you. Should I take that on its face? Is it trying to say something? It actually doesn't matter because it's just a funny idea. Fighting a boss called the King of All Crime who chomps a stogie, the smoke from which forms the words King of Crime. You could put me in a think tank for years and I wouldn't come up with something so asinine and yet effortlessly funny. Like all RPGs, the glue holding everything together is the combat. Space Funeral uses an active time battle system, which surprised me. RPG Maker 2003, as it turns out, is the only iteration of the series that allows you to use ATB by default. They removed it in future entries. I wonder why that is. It works fine. Philip and Leghorse have a nice selection of moves, but the game is easy enough that you can largely just rely on attacking. Also, the battle theme is a certified hood classic. It goes so hard, I started looking forward to fights. Reminds me of Goblin or something. The whole game is punctuated by these weird 60s psychedelic and synthesizer tracks, the offbeat nature and sloppiness of which fit the game like a damn glove. In the modern age, you probably wouldn't get away with pilfering licensed music in a game like this, but like a Tarantino movie, these tracks really do get the job done. Honestly, they could release an original soundtrack for this game on disc, and I'd pick it up. I've been introduced to some really cool stuff here. Spoilers for the ending, I guess, so go ahead and skip the next chapter if you plan on playing the game, but even if you are, I wouldn't really worry too much. In the end, Philip and Leghorse defeat a creature called Moon, It even kind of looks like the moon presence from Bloodborne. And the world is changed back to normal, which in this case it becomes a bland, personalityless place using default RPG Maker assets. That's pretty good. If there's one message to take away from Space Funeral, it's that it's better to cobble together an original game made from licensed music and Microsoft Paint artwork, have it be niche and probably unappealing, than to try and impress people with something safe and unoriginal. For the low price of free, you should check out Space Funeral. It's funny, it's short, and it's painless. It's a little piece of a time in game history when stuff like this could find an audience, however small. The combat, I could take it or leave it, but I will say this. In most RPG Maker games, the combat is balanced poorly. I'd rather have it be too easy than to have those devs who just give enemies way too much health to compensate for the lack of balancing. It doesn't have the strategy of Hylics or the original battle system ideas of Lawmage Academy, but we're not here for the combat. The only people showing up to your Space Funeral will be the friends you made along the way, so don't delay. Play Space Funeral today. Alright, it's been a long and difficult battle, but I'm happy to report that I've finally stopped crying, so I'm ready to talk about To the Moon. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that To the Moon is the most commercially successful game on this list, and considering its relative simplicity both in gameplay and visuals, the reason for that must go beyond the surface level. Released in 2011, To the Moon was developed by Freebird Games, a small handful of developers with big ideas. It's not an RPG, nor is it a weird narrative adventure game, but rather a more traditional point-and-click game. The premise hooked me right away. You play as a pair of technicians working for Sigmund Corp, a company that uses machines to impart artificial memories in terminally ill or coma patients. In essence, they allow dying people to live out their dreams or bucket lists before passing on, and you can probably see how this might become emotional. The technicians you play as, Ava, Rosaline, and Neil Watts, arrive at the residence of their next client, Jonathan, or Johnny Wiles, with the goal of fulfilling his wish, sending him to the moon. In order to create that simulation, the doctors need more information, so with their equipment they delve into his memories in order to find out why it is that he wants to go to the moon. The gameplay is very simple. You'll find yourself in different memories looking for objects or interactions strongly linked with Johnny's subconscious mind. After finding all of them, you'll deal with a simple slide puzzle and move on to the next section. The gameplay by itself isn't enthralling. At least on PC, it's pretty noticeable that RPG Maker wasn't intended to be a point-and-click engine. The grid-based coordinate system often confuses your character's pathfinding, and sometimes you'll have to click several times to have your actions registered. Aside from those minor gripes, the gameplay is functional, just not optimal. And besides, once again, it's not the gameplay that you're here for, it's the story. And the gameplay is intertwined with the story perfectly. As you find new objects or experience short interactions that Johnny once had, you'll gain context and learn more about his life. The narrative structure is unusual in that chronologically you start at the end of Johnny's life. You're emotionally disconnected in the beginning. All you know is that Johnny is an old man on his deathbed, living with a caretaker. As you traverse his memories in reverse order and experience his time on Earth, all of the great memories, the tragedies, these little slices of his life, the story becomes heavier and more bittersweet since you know how it ends. A man with no wife or children beside him tries to simulate an experience he couldn't have in his lifetime. As you become more attached to Johnny, it becomes not just the scientist's imperative but your own that this man lives out his dream before he passes. Speaking of the scientists, they're integral not just to the story but to the tone of the game. To the Moon is equal parts sweet and sad. Were it not for the comedic dynamic between our main characters, To the Moon would become almost excessively sentimental, or at the very least, relentlessly sad. Ava's straightforward and irritable attitude meshes with Neil's childishness really well, and their own personalities begin to clash as this straightforward job becomes more than just another job. For the most part, it's played for comedy to undercut the saccharine nature of the story, and most of the time it comes in clutch without being too overbearing. Occasionally the quips, sarcasm, and references are a bit groan-inducing, but it never strays far enough into that territory to be a problem, and without it, the story would be less human. And that's what To the Moon is all about. It's a celebration of humanity. You see Johnny and his then-wife River struggling with money. Johnny flounders, not knowing what to do as his wife's autistic tendencies become more prevalent as she ages. And no, I'm not using that word colloquially, by the way, she is on the spectrum. You see them find out in real time. or simulated time, I guess. All of their friendships, their hardships, the hobbies that make them tick. No matter where you are in life, there's something to relate to here, and that makes To the Moon's story feel so deeply personal. He may just be a video game character, but we all know a Johnny, and in some sense, we all are a Johnny. It makes the story feel more real than real life. Enhancing every twist and turn of the plot is the presentation, which is fantastic. The pixel art is beautiful, bringing these scenes to life with such limited resolution. Unlike other popular games made in the engine, everything here is custom art, sprites, animations, etc. There's a lot of visual detail without becoming too busy or cluttered, which is always a risk when it comes to working with 48 by 48 tiles. Along with the point-and-click interface, the visuals really help To the Moon feel distinct and transcend the engine it's built on. While the graphics are nice, the piece of presentation that elevates To the Moon is undoubtedly its music. There are times when it's fun and upbeat or tense and stressful. No matter what situation it's played in, it enhances the experience significantly. The tracks that really stand out are those played in emotional scenes. Friends, I tell you, music doesn't often affect me in this way, but I am fundamentally incapable of listening to this soundtrack without tearing up. What begins as a simple assignment becomes one of the most heartbreaking and deeply moving love stories I've ever seen, full stop, culminating in a beautiful finale. This game is about 3 to 4 hours long and doesn't waste a minute of that runtime, leaving you hopelessly invested throughout the entire story. Despite some minor frustrations with the interface and gameplay that feels a bit too simple, To the Moon was an unforgettable experience, and I'd recommend it to just about anyone. You can find it on Steam for 10 American dollar dues, and it's worth every penny. Finally, it's the cult RPG maker horror game to rule them all. It's The Witch's House. This game, Ao Oni, Mad Father, they all found a wider audience thanks to early 2010s reaction YouTube. Yeah, I don't miss it. I wanted to cover at least one of these and settled on The Witch's House because I believe it's the quintessential RPG maker horror game and probably the most popular. Released originally in 2012 and re-released with the updated MV version, which I'm playing, The Witch's House is, yeah, a horror game. It's not survival horror though, but rather a horror puzzle game. You play as Viola, a little girl who finds herself lost in the woods. Before talking about the core gameplay, I've just got to admire the presentation, especially in this beginning section. The foreground effects such as leaves blowing and light shafts pouring through the trees give the game an added dimension of depth, and the whole scene just looks like something out of a painting. So with nowhere to go, Viola heads into the eponymous Witch's House, where the vast majority of game takes place. If you've played games such as Silent Hill or Resident Evil, you'll find a grain of familiarity in the design of the Witch's House. Various sections of this house are blocked off, requiring you to find and sometimes combine items in order to progress. The puzzles in this game are fairly simple, but clever. Most of the game moves in a linear sequence, so if you're stumped, you can rest assured the answer is probably nearby. You don't have to traverse a large map to find something, like say, OneShot. The star of The Witch's House is undoubtedly The Witch's House, which is both a puzzle and a character in itself. The attention to detail in each separate room is superb, with a careful focus in setting mood through color and lighting, more so than any game I've talked about today. The ambient sound and sparing use of music really enhances that atmosphere too, making each room feel tense as your eyes dart around the screen, wondering how the house will play tricks on you this time. I found myself taking a wide berth around this cracked mirror just out of anxiety. The game messes with you in some pretty novel ways. It's hard to explain to someone unfamiliar with how the program works, but RPG Maker is somewhat limited in what it can actually do in terms of horror. The pathfinding sort of sucks ass, so being chased is usually out of the question unless the character doing the chasing is faster than the player character, which in a horror game would just be unfair. You can blend horror with RPG, such as in games like Sweet Home or World of Horror, but the element of terror is cut down this way, as self-defense becomes a laundry list of equipment and statistics rather than a primal sense of fear. So in order to create feelings of dread in the player, you have to either be creative or fall back on the classic spooky monster makes loud noise and chases the player until you find another room. The Witch's House does both. In fairness, back when it came out, there was more novelty in being chased by spooky things, but this style of horror has become so ubiquitous in RPG Maker games that Toilet in Wonderland has an entire section poking fun at it. What happens when you're touched by the scary thing? Well, you get a game over screen and have to try again. In that sense, gameplay can feel a bit unfair. There are times where death feels unavoidable unless you already know what's going to happen. The Witch's House lets you select the difficulty, which automatically reloads you from the nearest point after death, which certainly cuts down on frustration, but I would argue it still acts as a crutch for the game's limitations. The environment is occasionally intertwined with the plot, but it often takes the Resident Evil approach. I don't know why you need to arrange pedestals with colored dolls, the house is just built this way. There are a lot of points where the setting is pretty scary. This hallway with the mouth and eyes is an example of such. Just look at it. It's menacing! Eventually, because of how chase sequences work, you'll develop a sixth sense and prepare yourself for an encounter after every puzzle you solve. There's actually comparatively few puzzles that do involve enemies chasing you, but I like how the game sort of creates a permanent feeling of preparedness. The minute you let your guard down, something actually will emerge from the dark and get you. It reminds me of being a kid, when the adult pretends to be the boogeyman or the tickle monster, and it starts out fun and then you forget it's a game and start screaming in mortal fear for your life. Though it shares some similarities with survival horror puzzle solving, structurally the game is less like an intertwining mansion and more like a haunted house at an amusement park. Rarely do you revisit earlier sections, and most rooms are kind of a one and done, which is totally fine for cheap thrills. As The Witch's House clocked in about an hour and a half for me, it was a perfect amount of time for it to not overstay its welcome. This would actually be a good game to play with a group of friends with the lights out. I played with my girlfriend nearby and we had a good time figuring out the puzzles together and getting spooked by the numerous cheap but entertaining jump scares. As you travel through the house, you'll find diary entries written by the witch herself, lamenting her lot in life and detailing some gruesome activities that contextualize the world a bit. To say the game is sparse on plot is accurate, but I don't consider that a problem since the atmosphere of the game does a lot of heavy lifting. When it comes to horror, the answers to some questions are best left up to the imagination. There are multiple endings which can allow for some replayability, but the true ending of the game is shocking. Genuinely one of the most disturbing and unexpected twists I've seen in a horror game. Feel free to skip to the next chapter if you'd like to experience it for yourself, because I'm going to talk about it now. So at the very end, you successfully escape the house by way of a disturbing chase sequence where the legless, eyeless, tongueless witch slithers after you. As it turns out, you were the witch all along. Now let me explain. Viola and the witch were friends prior to the events of the game. The witch, suffering from terminal illness, becomes jealous and resentful of Viola, at which point, using magic, she switches their bodies. Before doing so, she mutilates herself, which effectively traps Viola's consciousness inside Ellen's body, a prison where she can't move, speak, or see. Oh yeah, Ellen's the witch, by the way. Ellen, in Viola's body, was forced to go back into her mansion in order to retrieve a tonic to escape the woods. She reveals that the house wasn't impeding her progress but helping guide her as the real Viola attempted to stop her. At this point, Viola's father arrives to rescue her. Seeing this monstrosity next to his apparent daughter, he shoots and kills the witch, who's really his daughter, helplessly trying to communicate with her own father. Ellen, playing the part of his daughter, takes his hand and they leave the forest together, where they live happily ever after? This ending is ceaselessly dark. The witch taunting Viola, knowing that she's in hell, your realization that you just assisted someone in committing a war crime, the implications of Viola's father raising this girl who's killed his daughter, believing it to be her. It's disturbing to ponder. This is an original and thought-provoking twist, on top of being totally unexpected. It really changes how you view different aspects of the game, and had you not played The Witch's House, it might be worth the price of admission for this sequence alone. Of course, if you hadn't played it and still wanted to, why? Why did you watch this section? I warned you, man. So that's The Witch's House for you. In light of other indies like Stardew Valley costing $15, I'm not sure I can recommend picking it up for the same price. $10 might be a bit more fair, considering that's the price you'd pay for OneShot or Fear and Hunger, which have a lot more meat on their bones. I think indie developers have a tendency to undervalue their work, which makes it tough to discern how much you should pay for a short roller coaster type experience such as The Witch's House. Because ultimately, that's what you're paying for, the experience. And to be frank, it's one you can largely have by watching a playthrough on YouTube. For me, it probably isn't worth the full price of admission, but if you enjoy the aesthetic, you like jump scares or feeling anxious with these type of games, and you got some friends who you want to spook, your mileage might vary. It's only about 90 minutes, but it's a tight and well-crafted 90 minutes. So there you have it, 10 games made in RPG Maker reviewed, and all I can say is I wasn't expecting this. Going into this video, I figured there'll be some decent stories and a lot of generic RPG gameplay, but that couldn't be further from the truth. This has been a celebration of creativity with some of the most unique and interesting experiences I've ever had. With the completion of each game, I was excited to see what would come next. They all offer such a vastly different take on this familiar format, pushing the limits of what RPG Maker is capable of, showing just what you can do with it. On that note, for all the engine elitists out there are any number of reasons somebody might not want to use a higher fidelity game engine. Maybe you just don't have the time or desire to learn a programming language. There's no shame in that. Maybe you don't need an excuse. I'm a firm believer that limitations can inspire creativity. You develop an understanding of what you're capable of when you work within boundaries, and you'll often find creative ways to push them into new territory. Analysis paralysis, feature creep, call it what you want, but it stopped many a talented developer from creating and finishing a project. Sometimes being forced to rein it in is what gets things done. It's what allows for odd little experiences or ambitious dreams to come into fruition. So before you throw stones from your glass house and disparage someone for working with RPG Maker, let me ask you a question. How many games have you made? Hey there, thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate the support. As I slave away in the proverbial salt mines working on my next review, I decided to take a little break and work on this bad boy instead, and I had a lot of fun doing it. I wonder why it is games like To the Moon or OneShot just hit me so much harder than these big, emotional AAA with motion capture and voice acting games. Just goes to show, presentation is secondary to story in these cases. Anyway, I want to thank my patrons for their patience as I noodle around with videos like this. Y'all are the best a man can get. And I'd like to thank those in my persons of lordly caliber tier in particular, including Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Sleepy, Avil, and Hime Takamura, two separate patrons in matrimony, Shrew Manalist, Scatmouth, Spencer Kennelly, I'm Emil Castagne's #1 fan, still fuck you for using that name, John, Captain, BB Squirrel, Raven, Francois, Fenrir Lives, Xenogears, and Olo Shadow. Words can't express how much I appreciate you all. You make what I'm doing possible. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please like and subscribe for the good of the YouTube algo robot, whose judgment is swift and decisive. If you really enjoyed the video and want to support the channel while netting some slick bonuses, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Madular. Links to this and my social media will be in the description. Until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.